say I was a farmer with spare buildings and I'm looking out over those buildings, what would you advise me to look at from a planning perspective?
So the first thing I would ask you, if you were my client, the first thing I would try and ascertain is, what are you trying to do it for? Are you just asking me because you feel you should do something with them, but don't actually really want to?
Yeah.
Which does happen.
Yeah.
But if there is a driver behind the question, it's trying to get to the nub of that really. So sometimes, and this normally comes down to their personal circumstances. So sometimes it's because they could do with some capital income. They could do with some an amount of cash to come in so that they can reinvest either in another farming project or a diversification project or a house for the child, whatever it is. So sometimes it comes out of a need for some capital. So how can we maximise the value of an asset, sell it, raise the capital, put that into something else? Or it could be buying somebody out or whatever. There's often needs for capital on farm, isn't there? Yeah. So sometimes the driver comes about because they need more income. So obviously age-old problem with farming and farming incomes and so on. So thinking, how can I produce an additional non-farming income onto the farm? Or a third scenario that crops up quite often is where a child wants to come back and obviously there's not enough work on the farm to sustain another person, so they're thinking, could we utilise these assets for a business or something and have that as an additional revenue stream for that additional person on the farm. So it's about trying to get to the nub of those, because how we advise them depends on what they want out of it, of course. If it's capital, then fundamentally, if we can identify any assets, any buildings which could be used for housing, whether that is steel frame barns through Class Q or traditional barns, then that is always the way that you will make the most amount of money out of them if you're going to sell them. So undoubtedly, trying to get permission for something to change it into a residential unit of accommodation will raise the most amount of capital against the building. But of course, you've then got to think about where that building is located. Is it central to the farming business, because you obviously can't sell off a barn that's right in the middle of the farmyard. So if it's an outlying barn, that's fairly straightforward. If it's on the edge, can we partition it off or hive it off? Or if it's a group of farmyard buildings, can we redevelop it and get permission for a new set of farm buildings? That's possible too. So again, strategy and just thinking about that. So that's raising capital, but obviously if we're talking about sort of trying to create a revenue income, quite often with additional incomes on farm, it broadly gets split into two types of things. One is the sort of passive income, which is where you get paid for rent or solar panels, or even something like a dog walking field is relatively passive. You haven't got to do a lot for that rental income or for that income.
So obviously you can continue with your farming business at the same time.
And it doesn't take a lot of labour or a lot of time, but you can change the use of something and have an income. But importantly, doesn't distract you from what you're doing. Because if you think about something like a glamping business or a farm shop or a dog kennels or something, that's a whole nother business in itself, and you've got to be able to run that. And that's fine if your child's coming home and that wants to be their business, but if it's you, all of a sudden you're not now farming, you're now trying to run a boarding kennels, and it doesn't work. So there's all of those things that come into play. So for us, when we're trying to advise from a planning point of view, we can in a blinkered way tell them what they can get planning for, but that's not really relevant when you're advising them of the wrong thing that's not going to achieve what they want to achieve.
Okay.